Okay, so we made it through the timeline, we survived. So we'll start talking about some of these big philosophical elements that are essential in understanding what makes Britain Britain. So if you remember back to early in January when we talked about forms of legitimacy, as an evolutionary democracy, there are two ways that we could claim that the UK is perceived as legitimate. First is tradition in both the or in the primarily in the existence of the monarch, right? The Queen is still alive and kicking. Um, Tradition in terms of the use of common law as their legal code, but then that also creates rational legal authority because their system of common law is what has governed them for centuries. They don't have a single codified constitution, which makes understanding how or why things should happen in a particular way a little challenging sometimes. Um, it makes the job of their Supreme Court a lot more challenging because it can't function in ways similar to other countries that do have a codified constitution. But they do have a patchwork of important legal documents from throughout their history that they will reference, and elements of a traditional system of common law which create rule of law in the United Kingdom. The role of the monarch has kind of shifted over time, and that becomes evident from what we saw in the timeline, that the monarch goes from having absolute power to being merely a symbol of British, excellence. And Parliament has gradually arisen in power, right? We saw the Magna Carta is signed in 1215, and then 200 to 400 years later, in the throughout the 1600s, we start seeing subsequent acts of Parliament to increase parliamentary sovereignty. We've also seen a gradual extension of voting rights over time, that the Industrial Revolution really creates an impetus to increase the number of people who get to participate in the political process. So you see the Great Reform Act of 1832 that increases the type of landowner or the type of working male who was able to participate in parliamentary elections. In 1867, it's extended to anybody who's in the working class. In 1918, women get the right to vote, but you'll notice that there's a discrepancy in age. Men over the age of 21 legally had the right to vote. Women over the age of 28 had the right to vote. And then a mere 10 years later, in 1928, the voting age is floored at 21 for both men and women. Political and economic change is really what has kind of driven the success of giving Parliament more power or authority over time. So we talked about the collective consensus in the timeline. The collective consensus really comes into existence after World War II and after the Belveridge Plan, that kind of notes the five, great evils in terms of like want and squalor and things like that. But the collective consensus is the idea that regardless of your political party or your political ideology, most people agreed that the government had a few crucial uh, tasks that they should work to complete. The first is narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, um, or primarily narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor. And then they do a bunch of things to create a welfare state. So one of the reasons why the collective consensus becomes a thing is that, the population of Great Britain is just decimated after World War I and World War II, right? You see a lot of, young able-bodied persons who are unable to work. You have, the question as to whether or not Britain could survive because so many people were killed, and is there a way that we could guarantee that people would make more babies to make more British subjects? So the goal of the welfare state programs created via the collective consensus were to do things like create pensions, establish a national system of healthcare, unemployment insurance, and any kind of assistance program to the poor. And like I've said several times, this leads to the creation of the NHS, or the National Health Service, which is one of the most both beloved and hated institutions in the United Kingdom at the same time. And when we talk in either the second or third set of notes, we'll look specifically at some controversies surrounding the NHS. But there is this notion that the state is responsible for not only promoting economic growth, but establishing what's called full employment, which economically speaking, full employment means that there's an unemployment rate, I believe it's below 3%, that you have, the government pushing corporations, factories, entities to create jobs, because if more people are creating jobs, then more people can be getting paid, more people can be participating in the economy. And if all of those things happen, right, then we see an increase in, hold on 1 second, buddy. We see an increase in quality of life of the Britons. Toby, you want to say hi to everybody? Yeah. Come say hi.
Hi.
All right, I'm going to pause so I can talk to Toby real fast, and then I'll talk some more. All right, sorry about that. They were making cupcakes because there are a bunch of birthdays the next couple of days. It was strawberry, and it was delicious. So in terms of talking about like the collective consensus creates a massive shift in the way policy gets done until the 70s. And I think I've got to click through all of these things again. Okay. So what happens throughout the 60s and the 70s is a tectonic shift in kind of the belief of what the government should do. There were questions of whether or not there were policies that the government instituted that were a bridge too far, were it too many interventions. You start to see people loudly advocate for free market economics, right? The traditional Adam Smith kind of laissez-faire capitalism. But then you start to see the rise of a figure by the name of Margaret Thatcher, who is a woman from a working class family who eventually becomes groomed into becoming the prime minister or the leader of the Conservative Party, with the goal of becoming the prime minister of the United Kingdom. And to describe the way she believes is to label her as someone who embraces neoliberalism as the philosophy for how the government should interact with the economy. So this 3-minute theory video that you have access to on Classroom kind of describes what neoliberalism is, and I'll kind of talk about on the next couple of slides how someone like Margaret Thatcher embraces neoliberalism. So she was a member of the Conservative Party long before 1979, but in 1979, she becomes the prime minister as the leader of the Conservative Party. She started becoming a loud voice saying that the reason why Britain was dealing with a recession, why Britain was seeing a weakened economy throughout the 70s, was because of socialist or collectivist policies, right? That while the collective consensus kind of pushed for a way to increase Britain's economy or increase the quality of life of British subjects, that the Parliament had done too much and had stifled any life from a traditional free market. So her goal was to root out any existence of state-owned enterprises, that she increased privatization of business and industry, right? That the government should now be someone who is on the sidelines in terms of dealing with the economy instead of the driving force. She said the social safety net, the social welfare programs that were created post-World War II were too broad and unnecessary, and they were doing too much to coddle British citizens. This is where she notoriously gets the nickname Milk Snatcher, because she cut subsidies for school milk programs. She was tough on labor unions because she believed labor unions placed too many unnecessary large demands on businesses, and those demands of the unions would stifle economic growth. And she started to wholly embrace a free market set of economic principles. So all of these reinforce or reflect the influence of neoliberalism as a political or economic philosophy. Neoliberalism essentially embraces classical liberalism that says competition is good, freedom is good, liberty is good, and the less that a government can do is better. So what you really start to see under the prime ministership of Thatcher is giving businesses the ability to grow and thrive and be more of the driving force of what happens in the UK, and being less reliant on what is happening because of government policies or demands. What you have here is a clip from a prime minister's questions with Margaret Thatcher, where she's kind of dressing down her labor counterpart, who is asking a question about the need to increase social welfare funding. So one of the things that people kind of get confused by is hearing that the conservative political party embraces neoliberalism. But what you need to kind of remember is that liberalism is something that is vastly, vastly differently defined in the United States than it is anywhere else, right? So when we're talking about liberalism in a classical sense, we are talking about minimal government interference, uh, more liberty, more free market economic principles, right? In terms of the American Republican Party, they are the ones who are more in line with a classical liberal philosophy, whereas the Democrats, who make arguments about the existence of a larger government to provide for the social welfare of its citizens, or the notion of the collective consensus in the United Kingdom, is more in the direction of larger government socialism. It's not full-fledged socialism by any stretch of the imagination, but that's what it's more in the direction of, right? So when Thatcher is labeling some of the policies she dislikes as socialist, right, she's right, and her neoliberal beliefs, kind of are a revitalization of old school, the invisible hand should guide the forces of the free market. Margaret Thatcher is very much one of those political figures who is either really, really loved or really, really hated. So here's just a collection of, random political cartoons that existed throughout her career. Here you have a collection of newspaper headlines that kind of look at her throughout her career in terms of being both positive and negative. One of the nicknames that also is most widely associated with Margaret Thatcher is the idea of being the Iron Lady. and the nickname comes from this speech that she gives. I can't remember what the circumstances are. When Margaret Thatcher died, the people who hate Margaret Thatcher started kind of pushing for Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, right? The song that is sung in The Wizard of Oz, to trend at #1, because people who hated Margaret Thatcher really believed that she did too much to destroy any hope of Britain attempting to, do anything positive for its citizens, right? And what you're looking at here in the bottom right is that it gets pushed to #1 on iTunes on the day that she dies. There was also a big push to have Radio 1, which is the radio broadcast entity controlled by the BBC, to ban playing the song if it was requested on the day of her funeral. So here you have kind of an interesting discussion amongst people who are representative of the BBC, discussing whether or not that level of censorship should be allowed or is necessary. But here is kind of a list of the different things that she does throughout her life, right? That she does things to help weather the economic storm, right? That in terms of looking at some of the statistics here on the side, right, that she does some things to promote more employment and economic growth, right? That you could look at some of these statistics and make the argument that she's probably successful in many shape or forms at revitalizing the British economy. So where her political career kind of ends is with a great degree of controversy, that she is functionally pushed out as being the leader of the Conservative Party in November of 1990, based from a challenge with one of her own peers. And if she did not resign or step down, there could have been a call for new elections, which may have risked the Conservative Party losing its majority. So she resigns 2 years later. You can see here she's given life status as a peer in the House of Lords, and we'll talk about what that means in the second set of notes when we talk about the difference between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But she dies in 2013. She has a stroke. And there, like I said, there were a lot of people who heavily mourned the death of Margaret Thatcher because they thought she single-handedly revitalized the British economy in a very, very big time of need. And then, you can also see that she's very much hated by her opponents, right? Because people wanted Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, to trend on the day that she A, died, and B, of her funeral. This clip from Channel 4 offers some insight into whether or not there was, a broader conspiracy or a broader plot to take her down. That you see some interviews with friend and foe alike who were members of Parliament on the day that days leading up to Margaret Thatcher's resignation. So if you're interested in more information on that, then you can check out this video clip. And John Major was not a very successful prime minister. Like I said on the timeline, you saw a lot of people defect from his party. You saw a lot of conservatives lose their seats in elections. And this video is kind of good to set the stage on who Tony Blair is. Tony Blair, at the time you are looking at this video, is the leader of the Labor Party, which is not the majority party at the time. And this is a clip from a prime minister's questions where Tony Blair just beats up on John Major, and it ends with him, calling him weak, weak, weak. So here's where we'll take our second break from this set of notes. And when we come back, we'll survive the final chunk of talking about Tony Blair and the Third Way, which will take us from 1997 all the way up to this day in the making of the British state.